starting a little bit late today. So this is class 2 of this series of Buddhism in a nutshell. Class 1 is on our YouTube channel, where we put just about everything a couple of days after we do it here. So in class 1, we mostly kind of set the stage, just how I described it last week. We talked about the life of the Buddha. So we haven't really gone into a lot about the philosophical side of things, except to say that we did spend some time looking at the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. So that part we did cover a little bit. And for today's class, we're actually going to initially switch gears before coming back to that. So we're going to switch gears into talking about the mind itself, talking about the Buddhist model of the mind. So, okay, so in Buddhism, the mind is described at its root, at its foundation, as that which is clear and knowing, or that which possesses clarity and awareness. These are the only two qualities that the mind ultimately is said to have. And as we sort of found last week, and as we will continue to find, it's necessary to always define terms, and that's going to happen throughout your study of Buddhism, because we are studying Buddhism in English, and a lot of it originally it was found in Sanskrit, and then as we are a Tibetan center, that lineage was translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, and now being translated again into English. So translators had to sort of do the best they could to use English words to denote or connote more, in many ways, more complicated phrases that could be multiple meanings or richer meanings that oftentimes are not immediately clear. Well, so maybe I shouldn't use the word clear, because we're about to define clear and knowing. So when we say clear or clarity, it can sound like we are talking about the mind as kind of free from any problematic, kind of pristine. And, not to get too complicated, but of course, we will talk about sort of levels of the mind, and there is what's called the mind of clear light. And that's the subtlest level of the mind, but that is a phrase, clear light, because the karmic appearance of that mind is of clear light. But it doesn't have the same meaning as clear here or clarity here. Clear or clarity in this context refers to the mind as a formless energy, simply meaning that it does not possess shape or color or size. It is a formless energy. So it doesn't mean pristine or free from problems, particularly at the coarser levels of the mind, the levels of the mind that operate for us in daily life. Certainly, that still is a formless energy, but it isn't. We can't say that it's pristine. It comes together, as we talked a bit about last week. that mind arises together with problematic states. So we're not suggesting, but it is true that the mind of clear light is, although the clear light, the phrase clear light, as I said, refers to how meditators experience that mind karmically or subjectively. It is true that we can remove these problematic states all the way down to the mind of clear light. And then the mind of clear light is capable of arising without any of these problematic states due to training, due to the ability, our potential to completely eliminate these, you could say, afflictive emotions or kleshas or stains in the mind, these problematic mental states that are arising in the mind at present. But here, what we simply mean is that the mind is a formless energy, and by knowing, again, we don't mean that the mind is able to know perfectly, or the mind is able to know without distortion. But the mind is able to generate some sort of internal representation of what the mind is directed toward. So when we see something, we hear something, we taste something, we think of something, when we use one of the consciousnesses of the mind, we can generate an internal representation that is not free of distortion, but is nonetheless a representation of what the mind is put upon. And this is how the mind functions. So we alluded to those consciousnesses, and here they are. Buddhism describes the 5 bodily sense consciousnesses and then the mental sense consciousness. So Buddhism talks about 6 consciousnesses, 6 types of consciousness. And so these are ways of perceiving. These are ways that the mind contacts an object. We contact an auditory object through the sensory consciousness of the ear, the ear sense power, the ear sense consciousness. We contact a gustatory object, an object of taste, through the taste sense consciousness, and so on. So there are unique objects in the world, and we contact them through their respective sense power. Some consciousnesses can be purely mental. If we imagine something, if we think of, a dragon, we're not seeing a dragon, we're not hearing a dragon, we're not touching a dragon. It's an imaginatory experience that's occurring purely in the mental sense consciousness. So that's possible. It's also the case that when one of the bodily sense consciousnesses contacts an object, the mental sense consciousness gets involved in that process. And this is an important thing to get clear on in Buddhism, because of the way that we can mistake what we are perceiving. And we talked a bit about this again last week, where when we observe using a bodily sense consciousness, we observe an object, almost always, well, Buddhism would essentially say always, that observation, that perception is going to be characterized by a judgment of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And that doesn't occur in the bodily sense consciousness. It isn't the eye sense consciousness that sees a pleasant object or an unpleasant object. It is not the taste sense consciousness that tastes a pleasant or unpleasant food or what have you. it's the mental sense consciousness that judges what the eye sense consciousness or the taste sense consciousness or what have you is experiencing, and will label it as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So the mental sense consciousness comes in afterward and makes a determination, a judgment about what is being experienced, and then gives it a label. However, for us, we don't have that precision in our subjective experience. So we experience the arising of the visual object, taste object, what have you, as coming together with that judgment, that determination of pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And that gives rise to the view that quality is really there in the object that's being observed, that's being perceived, because we don't really take into account exactly how this process unfolds. And that lack of clarity, that lack of precision, is what really gets us into trouble. And generating that precision, that clarity, can really help when we start to recognize that it is the mental sense consciousness that's labeling on top of the sensory data. And that's why this is an important topic. That's the practical benefit of studying this. It isn't just interesting to know, it's actually directly related to the arising of afflicted states, the arising of, and the arising of constructive, beneficial states as well. So let me pause. Are there any thoughts or questions so far about anything that I've said?
Yes, Venerable Dondrub, I have two questions. And one is, it occurred to me when you talked about the mind arises, so the clear mind arises with problematic states. Where do the problematic states come from? Does that mean they come from past life karma? Or do they come from the present circumstances we land in, such as a very non-nurturing environment, and then we develop fear right away from the time we're babies? Is that related to the past life karma, or is that just a circumstance we landed in? That's the first question.
Yeah, so for us, as an ordinary sentient being, the idea of the mind of clear light being the subtlest level of the mind, for us, that even that level of mind is still obscured. In and of itself, it arises with. It's not those stains. Just, it wasn't really your question, but I just want to make sure that I spoke clearly. That the mind is obscured presently for us as ordinary beings. The mind co-arises or is obscured by these afflicted states. The mind of clear light itself, if and when we can free the mind of those stains, those afflictions, then the mind of clear light isn't in and of itself problematic. The mind of clear light doesn't have to be added to or changed in any way. We simply need to remove the obscurations, the afflictions that are obscuring the mind of clear light. But to your question, what Buddhism would say is that it's really both. It's a combination of both of those things maybe three things. The first is that Buddhism doesn't assert like a fall, like the Christian idea, like there was before a certain point, everything was great, and then something happened, and now things are not great. The mind has always arisen with afflicted states. So in that sense, and they don't really go into any more detail than that as far as I'm aware. They don't really, there's something innate about ordinary mind that empowers affliction, that empowers seeing things in a way, that colors every single act of perception from the moment of entering into any ordinary life. From that first, there are no moments that an ordinary sentient being has that aren't colored in a way or through a lens that empowers the arising of afflictions. And so that's just always been, there's always been that sort of empowering condition of what's called fundamental ignorance, or marigpa, that has always been a quality of ordinary mind. In every moment of ordinary mind's existence, every act of perception is colored in a way or empowered in a way that gives rise to afflicted states. So, based on the beginningless past lives that we have that have all been colored in that way, we have laid down imprints in the mind. We have laid down tendencies and habits in the mind, karmic tendencies, karmic habits. And those can be and are, as you said, triggered by circumstance. Because, we're not always angry. We're not always jealous. We're not always greedy or covetous, or we don't always have ill will, except, all of these sorts of problematic states. They don't arise in every moment of sometimes we are quite compassionate. Sometimes we're quite generous. Sometimes, those more positive mental states are what are really powerful at a particular time. But then under certain causes and conditions, that, because we have the imprint, because we have the seed from beginningless past lives, there are causes and conditions that can activate, that can cause that seed to manifest. And then in that moment, ill will is expressed, or covetousness, or, what have you. So it's really kind of those three things working in combination.
I see. Thank you. Yeah. So the mind is a project that we have to develop. I mean, if we want to get closer to the clear light stage, we have to train and develop the mind.
Yeah. I mean, Buddhism is about understanding what the causes and the conditions of affliction are, and what the causes and the conditions that eliminate afflictions, what those are, and then cultivating the causes and the conditions that eliminate affliction.
Okay, thank you, Venerable. Do you want me to wait and give the second question later? Because I don't know, it might take too long to answer. I don't know.
I will let you know.
Okay. Okay, so my second question is, what is the relationship of the mind to the brain, the actual organ of the brain? Because all those other types of consciousness are bodily, and then the sixth one is mental. But so anyway, that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, Buddhism would say that all of the that there's a empowering condition, that the ear sense power actually isn't, it's mediated through like the membranes, and so, the tympanic membrane and the hairs, and so there's ways, if you damage that, of course, because in the gustatory, like, it's mediated through you can cut your tongue out, and then of course you couldn't taste anything, right? Or you could, really you could, with acid or something, you could really, and then but they actually describe that there's like a subtle empowering condition that's non-physical, that is mediated by the physical, the tympan, all of these things. So in a way, it's not the, it's not exactly that it's purely like material in nature. There is a material aspect. And the same is true of the mental sense consciousness, of course. In Buddhism, historical Buddhism, they don't talk about the brain. They didn't, they didn't know, of course. And so that never, no one really thinks that it's important to, of course, there are modern thinkers and so on that try to write books, but you don't find any discussion in historical Buddhism of that sort of thing, because what the Buddha talked about was the mind and not these physical things. So because of course we do know that if you damage the brain, just like if you damage your membrane in your ear and so on, then your mental sense power will be negatively impacted if you cut out parts of the brain, or if there's a stroke or something. So you don't find any actual discussion of that relationship in historical Buddhism. But what we can assert is that because the mind is a non-physical energy whose nature it is to know, then we can assert that the mind, and actually the entire body, not just the brain, because again, like I said, it's understood that the mind pervades the whole body. And the brain certainly, just like the ear, has a role to play, and just like the tongue has a role to play in how the mind is expressed through the body, the brain also has a role to play in how the mind is expressed through the body. So Buddhism would say that you can't damage, you can damage the brain, you can damage the ear, and so on, but you can't damage the mind. You can't take away the mind's ability to know, to think, to perceive. You can only take away the ability of that to be expressed. And maybe you could say that there are levels of the mind, the levels of access to that subjectively a person who is alive, who hasn't developed like meditative, deep meditative states, they may only have access to coarse levels of the mind that are strongly mediated by the brain and so on. But other people who have developed these deep levels of meditative skill, you could say that maybe even in a coma, or even that they can still have access and still be engaging in even practices, meditations, so on, that are impossible for someone who doesn't have that access, because the mind is not the brain, and the mind is operating independent of the brain, at least at subtler levels. But yeah, you don't find, you won't find a sutra or, etc., where that is laid out. But it isn't just the brain. The mind is mediated, as I said, they talk about the winds that the mind rides on that pervade the whole body. And so, when you attend to the sensation that arises in the knee, or the hand, what is appearing to the mind is that the mind is literally kind of moving into, the mind is attending to that, and the winds are kind of moving into that area, and then that becomes what the mind is aware of. That awareness, that the mind is being directed to that. And in order for that to happen, the mind has to pervade the whole body. And of course, there's ways of talking about how that is also mediated by, you could say, the central nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, how that innervates the body as well. But still, the mind is non-physical. So it's mediated but separate from all of that.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay. So, if we're to describe then how an act of perception arises, we would say that you have one or more of the six consciousnesses, and then you have an object of awareness and a prior moment in the continuity of the mind. So, in order to hear something, you need to have an auditory object. You can't, if you have a visual object but no auditory object, then there's nothing for the ear sense power to become aware of. If you have a visual object but no taste object, there's nothing for the tongue sense or the taste sense power to become aware of. So you have to have the object of awareness, one or more of the six consciousnesses. It has to be active. And then you have to have a moment in those sense powers that precede the arising of that object, one millisecond before, because if you're in deep sleep, for example, or any kind of sleep, perhaps there are visual forms, even if your eyes are simply closed, you open your eyes, and then that it takes whatever time it takes for the light to hit your eyes and then for that to be generated. So you need that prior moment in that sense power in order to perceive the object that's outside of oneself. So that's just a way of kind of precisely talking about this process. Okay, so then Buddhism would assert that the nature of this mind that we all possess is a beginningless and endless continuity of those mental moments that we just described. Moments where there are thoughts or emotions or memories, or sounds or tactile sensations, all of these discrete mental events. Every time we have a thought, every time that we have a memory, every time that we have an emotion, every time that we see or hear or taste or touch, etc. And we're doing, of course, many of these simultaneously. But what Buddhism would say is that these are that the way that they talk about it is that even in a finger snap, the time that it takes to snap the fingers, which is, I don't know, 1/16 of a second or what have you, there are 64 discrete mental events that great meditators can discern even in that incredibly short period of time. So the way that Buddhism describes the mind is kind of like a movie where each, for us, it subjectively seems like a seamless sort of monolithic thing, but it's composed of individual frames, just that are played at a really rapid rate that give the illusion of movement, continuity, kind of seamlessness. But, again, but of course, this is coming from great meditators, and for us, we don't have access to that. But they can kind of slow down that process of cognition, and they have observed that they can actually label 64 individual mental moments in each finger snap of time, which, I guess before stopwatches, that was the best way they could, give a way of talking about this that people could kind of wrap their heads around. So that's how the mind works, is in these discrete mental moments. And that process is asserted here, as I said, to be both beginningless and endless, that there isn't a first moment of mind and there's no last moment of mind, that mind has always existed and mind will always exist. Okay, so that is a little presentation of the Buddhist model of the mind. Any thoughts or questions about that? Okay, so now we're going to switch gears again and talk about what are called the four seals. And this, the word seal here, kind of means like a royal seal, like the wax seal that a signet, ring is pressed into on a letter. And the purpose of that maybe that was a practice back 2,600 years ago or something, that they were, something like that, where that wax seal certifies the contents. It basically says, because this has the wax seal of the king, and if it was broken, if you opened it, it would break and you could see it was tampered with. If it's unbroken, then you can be certain that the contents are an authentic communication from the king, that seal indicates that. And so these are four things that we can use to authenticate any teaching, any philosophical idea, and determine for ourselves if it comports with what the Buddha taught, or if it's not a valid Buddhist teaching. It could be a teaching from a incompatible philosophical or religious system. That's not to say that one is better than the other. It's just simply to say this is, if you're studying Buddhism, it then becomes important to be able to critically reflect on teachings that you're receiving, because people, you might go to a teaching, and if that person's making things up, or if they don't really, you would need a way of authenticating, a way of saying, well, no, this clearly violates one of the four seals, and therefore I know it's not a genuine Buddhist idea. So that's the idea of the four seals. So we'll discuss the four seals. So the first of the four seals is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. So we have to define compounded phenomena and impermanent. So compounded phenomena is anything that is made up of parts, anything that exists as what's called a product, or is the result of the coming together of causes and conditions. So if it comes together due to causes and conditions, if it has parts, then we would say it's a compounded phenomena. And basically, almost anything that we can interact with on the earth is a compounded phenomena. Tables and chairs and dogs and cats and plants, and they all exist because of causes and conditions, and they all have parts, and so they're compounded phenomena. There are very few things that are not compounded phenomena. For example, the concept of space is not a compounded phenomena. Which doesn't mean, so there's two kinds of space. There's intermediate space, which is the distance between myself, or two, any two things. So we can say this chair is 5 feet away from this chair, and there's space in between. That's intermediate space. That's a compounded phenomena because it's changing. It's we can talk about, well, this part of that space, this upper part, the lower part, the front part, the back part. We can say that there's this many cubic centimeters of space between these two things, etc. But then there's the idea of space, which is just the lack of unobstructed contact, of obstructed contact. So just the idea that things exist without, that if you look at the universe, you've got planets and you've got asteroids, and they all can exist because in general, space as a concept is simply the lack of obstructive content. There's the ability for things to exist in space. And that's not compounded because it doesn't have a boundary, it doesn't have parts, it's just the lack of obstructive contact. But when you're discussing the distance between two things, then you're talking about intermediate space, and it's compounded. So, yeah. So, but on a practical level, essentially, everything that we interact with is a compounded phenomena. And compounded phenomena, therefore, are impermanent, which means they change moment by moment by moment. And so impermanent then, importantly, doesn't mean temporary. There are things that are impermanent but eternal, like the mind. The mind is changing moment by moment by moment, but the mind, as we've said, is beginningless and endless. And then there's the body, though, which is also impermanent. And there will come a time when the body can't be talked about as the body because it has, it has died and then it has decayed to the point where it's just, free atoms. And we can't talk about that as a body. And the same is true of computers and tables. And so it is also true that a consequence of impermanence for many things is that they will cease to function as what we call them, and therefore that phenomena, the phenomena of a table, a chair, a human body, an animal body, a plant form, etc., that phenomena is temporary. That specific phenomena is temporary because at a certain point, it can't validly be labeled as the same phenomena. But that's simply a consequence of impermanence. It's not the meaning of impermanence because you can have things that are eternal and yet impermanent, like the mind. So the word impermanent is a technical word that only means that which changes moment by moment by moment, that there are no two moments in the continuity of that thing that are the same. It does not mean temporary, but temporary can be a consequence of impermanence. If it wasn't impermanent, if the body wasn't impermanent, if the tables and chairs weren't impermanent, then they would be eternal. Then they'd be frozen. They would be unchanging, and nothing could act upon them. They could not become damaged. They could not age, etc. But because they are impermanent, then living things can age. Physical objects can degrade by exposure to heat and cold and water and just the oxidative environment of the air and so on. Okay. So that's the first seal. Second seal. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the definition. Sorry. This is the definition of compounded phenomena. Anything that exists as a product. Okay. Second seal. All contaminated things are unsatisfactory. So here again, we have to define contaminated thing and unsatisfactory. And contaminated thing, in English, it seems like quite a harsh way of talking. But what it means is that essentially what it means is that it has past karma and delusion as its origin. Anything that has past karma and delusion as its origin is a contaminated thing. And so another way of talking about it, or, is really just ordinary thing, because, we are ordinary. We, our body and mind, as an ordinary being, we have past karma and illusion as our origin. If we didn't, we would be enlightened. And so any environment that is populated by ordinary beings is also therefore populated by contaminated things. So now it's true that there are enlightened beings on the earth, and they don't experience the world, you know, in a in that way. They are experiencing the world differently, and that's why, it doesn't mean that it's like inherently or intrinsically only able to be experienced in a particular way. Simply means that the origin of it was past karma and delusion. So enlightened beings are not contaminated things. The environment of enlightened beings is not a contaminated thing, but that's kind of referring to the pure lands and sort of the environment that's manifested from the mind of an enlightened being. Okay, and by unsatisfactory, what we mean is that contacting a contaminated thing can never give rise to genuine, permanent, lasting happiness, contentment, and so on. So, food and music and, sensories, basically anything that an ordinary being can contact on the earth and or in other realms, can't actually, doesn't have the power to satisfy. It because it has past karma and delusion as its object, and of course because the body that is also doing the contacting is also a quote unquote contaminated thing. Even our body can't, give rise to, isn't capable of giving rise to pure, uncontaminated bliss, contentment, and so on. We have to create the causes and the conditions to no longer have a body and mind that has past karma and delusion as its origin, in order to be able to give rise to genuine, permanent, lasting, as I said, bliss, enjoyment, contentment, and so on. As long as we continue to appropriate contaminated aggregates, a contaminated body and mind, a body and mind that has past karma and delusion as its origin, will never be truly happy, will never be truly satisfied. So as I said, enlightened beings, their origin, their cause is not past karma and delusion, and therefore they are not contaminated things. So that's the goal. That's the point, is to try to give rise to those causes and those conditions, and let go of appropriating contaminated aggregates. Sorry, I keep skipping these definitions. Okay. So the third seal, all phenomena are selfless. So this is, as I did mention, that we talked a little bit. We've talked a little bit today about this idea of fundamental ignorance, which is how we misunderstand actively every time that we engage in an active perception. The way in which we misunderstand, we alluded to a little bit, is to give things a status, sort of an overly concretized status. As we mentioned, like this idea that we taste something pleasant and we think that that pleasantness is baked into the object. We think that it's part of what's outside of oneself, and that gives that object a solid status that it doesn't really have, because that's a mental projection that's layered on top of the sensory data. That's kind of one way of thinking about it. But as I mentioned last week, the fifth class in the series is where we will spend the most amount of time unpacking this idea of selflessness. But basically, what we can say at this point is we, as an ordinary sentient being, we experience things in that concretized way. And the Buddha's observation is that the phenomena itself isn't like that we experience it like that, but the phenomena doesn't actually exist in the way that an ordinary sentient being is experiencing it. But we will unpack this. It just takes time. So we will unpack it mainly in the last class in the series. And of course, even then, it's a very, very broad overview. This is a topic that in Buddhism people spend decades studying. So we'll talk about it for maybe an hour in the fifth class, and we'll just get a very, very rudimentary understanding. Unfortunately, of course, because my own understanding is very limited and very rudimentary of it. So, but we'll at least get it. It'll make some sense by that time. Okay, sorry, I skipped. So then you have the fourth seal, nirvana is peace. So we talked last week about sort of this idea of lower nirvana and full enlightenment, these two paths that the Buddha taught, these two valid paths of training. Lower nirvana being what is sought and accomplished by Theravadan practitioners, and full enlightenment as what is sought and accomplished by Mahayana practitioners. But both of these states are a complete cessation of suffering for the mind of the practitioner who accomplishes them. And only, those two one of those two accomplishments is genuine peace. So if someone starts talking about the idea of heaven being, something that Buddhism doesn't have that idea. They have the idea of, these two paths that the Buddha taught, either what from the Mahayana perspective we might call lower nirvana, or this idea of full enlightenment. These are two paths of training, both taught by the Buddha, and they both lead to genuine, true cessation of suffering for the person who accomplishes them. And that's the only one of those two is the only stated goal of Buddhist practice. And it does result in peace for that practitioner. Okay, so those are the four seals, these four ways of being able to learn how to recognize whether someone is discussing a Buddhist idea or not. So if someone says that, things are permanent, things are unchanging, or if they say that, that there's some way of, giving rise to perfect bliss and happiness with our body, or our or sensory, there's contradictory ideas that a person might espouse, and using the four seals we can determine or judge whether something comports to the Buddhist view or not. And again, like I said, it's not to say that Buddhism is right and these other ideas are wrong. It's just simply to say, how can we authenticate what we're hearing, if that's of interest? Any thoughts or questions about the four seals? Oh, I'm sorry. Christopher sent me a chat that I didn't C. Are uncompounded phenomena also selfless, also lacking inherent existence? Do uncompounded phenomena lack inherent existence? So, like I said, in terms of everything that we can basically, essentially, almost anything that we could interact with, and that, because I mean, the idea of uncompounded space isn't something that triggers affliction or triggers delusion. Um, so whereas, food and, other people and, sensory objects, these are all compounded things, and those are what gets us into trouble. And so that's why the Buddha taught the concept of selflessness is in relation to the objects that we interact with, that that are the things that trigger uh, the arising of delusion in the mind, and lay down these seeds, these tendencies. Um, I just haven't come across a teaching that correlates uncompounded phenomena and emptiness. Buddhism would say that, um, quote unquote, everything is empty of inherent existence, everything. But is that qualified? When we talk about just the idea of unobstructed contact, does that have, is there a way of talking about that being selfless? The way that they talk about things being selfless is that, they have parts, they have causes and conditions, and there's an active mental imputation, an active mental labeling. So they exist as a dependent arising rather than something from its own side. And can a mind relate to an uncompounded phenomena in a way that concretizes it? I just haven't come across a teaching on that. But I would say that, on a practical, just on a more practical level, what the Buddha is concerned about are the phenomena that we really are interacting with, the things that we're tasting and touching and seeing and hearing, and those things, are the objects, are the things, because they really don't talk about, when they talk about what we take as objects to refute, they talk about the body, the mind, other, and I mean, really, the main object that we take in meditation, is the way that we perceive of ourselves. And so, the body-mind complex, is the object that we mainly use to arrive at the insight of selflessness. So that's all I know or can say about that. It would be an interesting question to ask Geshe Sherab, when he's teaching. Any other questions?
I have one question
Mm-hmm.
on the third seal.
Mm-hmm.
So, is the unsatisfactoriness of contaminated phenomena associated with the mind's karmic or klesha imprinting of a label on it, or with just simply the impermanence of all things?
I would say that, um, it it isn't that the object, is only able to have an effect for a short, that's, conventionally speaking, that's one way of talking, is that, well, you might have an incredible dessert, but you have to keep, you kind of have to keep repeating that experience because it's a dessert. It's a compounded phenomena, and so it's temporary in that way. But I would say that it's unsatisfactory simply because it has past karma and delusion as its origin. That's the reason that it's unsatisfactory, is because it's not associated with enlightened mind.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll switch gears sort of again. We're kind of hopping from seemingly, not super related concepts today. But we'll talk about the five lay precepts. And because this is sort of related to, in a way, we just talked about the Four Seals, which is what characterizes Buddhist philosophy. And here, the five lay precepts are what characterize Buddhist ethics. So you could say that they're related, concepts in that sense. This is the five lay vows are the foundation of what the Buddhist ethical teachings are. It's not the extent of the Buddhist ethical teachings, but it is the foundation of the Buddhist ethical teachings. Okay, so we will go through these. The first precept is do not kill. And so when we say precept, so there's maybe two things to backtrack. The five lay precepts are generally taken when a person formally becomes Buddhist. They're often, it isn't always that way. Formally becoming Buddhist means to go for refuge, to take take the refuge ceremony. And it could be that a person only takes the refuge vows and commitments. That's possible. It's very common, though, that a person will take the refuge vows and commitments together with the five lay precepts. And so that's important in the sense, as I said, it's not the extent of Buddhist ethics. These five things are understood or presented by the Buddha as kind of coarser ethical guidelines where it's reasonable for a person to take them formally in a ceremony and say, I will never do these five things. So that's the reason why, one of the five lay precepts isn't to raise your voice in anger. Buddhism would be concerned, the Buddha would be concerned about raising your voice in anger with someone. That's not a great thing to do, but it's unreasonable to say, I will never raise my voice in anger. We should try to work on that and kind of move in that direction, but it wouldn't be reasonable to say that we could, in a ceremony, just decide for the next 50 years, I will not do it. But the five lay precepts, we are saying, I will not do. Now, of course, we will see that that's the ideal, and still we'll make errors, we'll make mistakes in relation to these. And we try to purify, and we'll talk about purification. So because it's a precept, it's a training precept, there are things that damage the vow, and there are things that destroy the vow. And when we say destroy, we mean we can't really say that we are taking it seriously enough to really say that we're holding that vow. And then the idea is you have to take it again. You've disregarded the training to the point where you have to take that again. You're just not taking it seriously. So the precept of do not kill applies to here. It says, killing any non-human sentient being damages the vow. So it applies to all non-human sentient beings. It does apply to that collection. And a non-human sentient being is something that can go all the way down to insects, goes all the way down to mosquitoes, to ants, to cockroaches, etc., flies, etc. So we're meant to really make an effort to not kill even insects. But of course, to go 50 years and never kill an insect is really difficult. So, it doesn't destroy the vow. However, if we intentionally take the life of a human, that does destroy the vow. And the reason that Buddhism makes a distinction here is because a human has the potential to achieve full enlightenment in that body, with that particular combination of body and mind. In that brief lifetime, it's possible to achieve enlightenment. And if you kill a person, you're separating body and mind, and you've taken away that potential for that lifetime. And that's harmful. That's much more harmful than to kill a mosquito, because a mosquito body and a mosquito mind, the way that mind is expressed, you could say, the way that the mind is expressed in a mosquito's body, given that limitation, the mosquito can't achieve enlightenment as a mosquito. It isn't possible. But a human has that potential. And that's why Buddhism distinguishes between the two. Also, much easier not to kill a human than it is to, as a practical matter, we are killing insects, sometimes, but we've probably not killed any people. And so we can probably, continue doing that much easier. Okay. Any thoughts or questions about the first precept? Nope. Second precept, do not steal. So stealing has a specific, perhaps new definition that we are agreeing to follow when we take the precepts. Maybe we followed a different understanding prior to that, and that's okay. When we take the precepts, we are saying that to steal is to take anything that has not been freely given. And we can say freely given by someone who has authority to give it. So, if someone themselves has stolen something, they don't really have authority to give it. But if we don't understand that they stole it, then we might think that they do, and then that's okay from our side, from our karma. We didn't know it was stolen. So if we then, we might take something out of, we might think, oh, this is something that someone threw away, they don't want it, and so I'll just take it. But we're not, we can't be really sure. What we can say is that it doesn't belong to us. Maybe it's on the curb, maybe we think it's something that, but we know that it's not mine. We know I didn't buy it, I didn't construct it, it's just out there. So that is stealing from the Buddhist perspective. It's taking something that's not been, now if there's a sign on that says, please take, then of course, now it's been freely given, and that's fine. But what is being said here is that we have to be really, really clear in our own mind that what we are taking has been freely given. If there's any kind of doubt or question, or it's not clear, then we should just leave it. We shouldn't take it. And this is also like, if we see $5, on the street, We know in our mind someone who owns that dropped it, and it still belongs to that person. It's not ours. We might think, well, there's no possible way I can reunite that with the person who dropped it. And so someone else is going to steal it, from the Buddhist perspective, but we shouldn't be that person. We shouldn't take that for ourselves. If we want to take it to, if it's like a whole wallet or something, and we want to pick it up and take it to a police station, then that's okay. We're trying to reunite it with that person. But if we appropriate it for ourselves and we think now everything in this wallet is mine and I can spend it, then that's stealing, even though it could be just a blank, totally empty. Because maybe that person will retrace their steps. Maybe they'll come back and maybe they'll find it. Could happen. And we're preventing that from happening. So the idea here is to just, if there's any doubt that the thing that we're appropriating for our use hasn't been freely given by the person who owns it, we should just decide that's nothing to do with me. I'm leaving it alone. Okay, third precept, do not lie. To lie is to intentionally communicate something that you know to be untrue to a sentient being that can understand you, who is subsequently deceived. So communicate can be verbal, it can be, gestural, it can be written, it can be visual, any kind of way of expressing information is communicating. You do have to know that what you're communicating is untrue. So if you yourself are deceived, then it's not a lie. And it has to be to someone who is a sentient being, who is awake, who is able to comprehend what you're saying, and who then, acts under the influence of what you're saying. If you're joking, if you're sort of exaggerating and that person knows that you're joking and you know that you're joking, but still, do they know that you're joking? Like, they might be deceived. They might think that you're being serious when you say something that you intended. You knew it was untrue when you said, "Oh, I caught a 30-foot grouper or something," or a whale shark, or you might think you're telling a tall tale, but they might really think that you did, and then they're deceived, and then you told a lie because you knew it was untrue, and they believed you. So we do have to be really clear. We do have to be clear about, is there any possibility? Just like we need to be really clear, does this belong to me or not? Should I leave it alone? We need to be really clear. Is there any possibility I could be deceiving this person? Could they operate under the mistaken view that what I said is accurate, that what I said is true? Because then that's not great. Now, with this, we do also have to use some common sense, in the sense that Buddhism isn't saying that we always tell people what they are asking if by disclosing certain things, someone might come to harm. If someone is in danger and they're hiding, and the person that poses that danger asks us if we know where they are, Buddhism isn't suggesting that we tell that person and put that person in jeopardy. We might just say, look, I'm not getting involved in this. This is none of my business. I'm not talking to you about this. None of that is a lie. So Buddhism isn't, and if the situation really calls for it, we may have to say something that isn't true. If there's a really clear purpose that is serving a really important good. But that takes wisdom. That requires, that we're really sure that that's true. Excuse me. So, but it's just to say that Buddhism isn't saying that no matter what the consequences of our words are or our communication are, we have to always give people what they would like to hear or what they're asking or that sort of thing. We need to have an awareness of the consequences of what we say or how we communicate. But essentially, we need to live our life in an undeceptive way. We need to not try to cause others to be deceived, is the general takeaway. We need to be honest with people. We need to be on the up and up, with everyone that we deal with, and not try to be deceptive. Okay, the fourth precept, do not commit sexual misconduct. Sexual misconduct has two ways in which it can manifest. It can manifest as adultery or non-consensual sexual behavior. Adultery does not, in our language, we usually use adultery in terms of a marriage, and it doesn't mean that here. It does mean that there is, as it says here, a reasonable expectation of monogamy. So you're in an intimate relationship with someone, and there's an understanding between the two of you that you are monogamous. If you then violate that, then you've committed adultery. Whether it's a dating relationship, whether it's a marriage, is irrelevant. What is relevant is the existence of the understanding between the two people that that relationship is monogamous, is exclusive. If the understanding is, do whatever you want, then when you do whatever you want, you're not committing adultery. If that's the understanding of all of the people involved. If you don't know that another person is, we can also do this if we are single, but we do know that the other person is in a committed monogamous relationship, then we are violating that monogamous relationship, and then they haven't taken the vow, but they technically are committing that violation, but we're also committing it. Now, if we don't know that, if we thought that they were single and we genuinely thought that, then only they engaged in a mistaken action, a harmful action. But it does also apply if we violate someone else's relationship intentionally, knowingly, because that's very harmful. That that inflicts a lot of pain and distress on people to do that intentionally. And then, of course, anything that's non-consensual, anything that the other, whether if they did not invite or want that behavior, then we also commit sexual misconduct. So this is on a spectrum. Just like with killing, we said that to kill an animal does not destroy the vow; it damages the vow. So whereas a human destroys the vow, so that's kind of a spectrum. This is also understood to be on a spectrum, and that spectrum is with respect to the act that we're talking about. So you could say, if you're in a monogamous relationship and you're flirtatious with someone outside of that, or you start having like a lot of private dinners, or there's like hand holding, that's not great. You're not taking that monogamy seriously in a way. So you're damaging the vow. From the Buddhist perspective, what destroys the vow is a fully consecrated sexual act, and we all know what that means. That's so kissing, hand holding, etc. Those are things that damage the vow. And of course, there's just even verbally, you might say inappropriate things, but what destroys it is a fully consecrated sexual act with that person, whether it's under the umbrella of adultery or the umbrella of unwanted or non-consensual. Then you have to, again, the idea is that you are not taking it seriously and you can't really be said to be holding it. Okay. And then the fifth precept is to not take intoxicants. So an intoxicant is a substance that causes what's called heedlessness that doesn't serve a medicinal purpose. So we know, of course, when we take maybe heavy painkillers, that it can cause a lack of inhibition, it can cause disorientation, and so on. But we're taking it under the guidance of from a doctor. And so, yes, we need to be mindful maybe about limiting our social engagement, maybe, or as it says, don't operate heavy machinery, so we need to be mindful of those circumstances. But there's a medicinal purpose. So it doesn't really have anything to do with what kind of substance it is, whether it's legal, whether it's illegal, etc. Although probably there are very few times when something illegal, would be medicinal. But it could depend on the circumstances. If you're in the jungle, if you're lost in the jungle and, you need painkillers, even if it's, maybe an illegal substance, then, you don't have access to something better. So in that circumstance, no problem, because you're doing it because you're genuinely suffering, you're genuinely in pain. And that may be the only thing that you have access to. But probably as long as you're in civil society, probably your medicinal substances are not going to be illegal. So that's what we have to ask ourselves. Am I genuinely unwell? Am I genuinely trying to move myself back just to functioning, just to wellness? And am I trying to do that with the least amount of side effects, with the least amount of psychoactive effects? These things may have a psychoactive effect, but am I just trying to function? Am I just trying to get back to baseline? Or am I doing it because, nothing is wrong, but I just like the psychoactive effect? Then it's an intoxicant. Now, with this, again, if a person hasn't gone for refuge, hasn't taken the 5, then, a person can still study Buddhism and so on. And none of these apply to a person who's formally agreed to be bound by the 5 precepts. Now, it is true that in the West in particular, for many practitioners, it's not black or white. Because again, there's this idea of heedlessness. That's what the Buddha is concerned about. The Buddha doesn't object to people going out and dancing and having a good time, and but this idea of heedlessness means that due to the psychoactive effect, we may not be able to respond appropriately to our environment. We may not be able to remember the other vows that we've taken. We may not be able to restrain our actions. And so we're in danger of engaging in non-virtue, in harmful actions because of the heedlessness. So, is a single alcoholic drink going to lead to heedlessness? Probably not. So that is kind of a question for people to decide for themselves. In a way, can I still have participate in a champagne toast, or have a single drink here and there with dinner, have a glass of wine with dinner, etc. The strict way is really, as it says, do not take intoxicants. But many times, in particularly more so in the West, this idea of a single drink here and there, is something for people to decide. I would also say it does depend on if a person is taking this formally in a ceremony. How does the preceptor, how does the person that you're taking the vows from, how do they understand themselves to be giving the vow? When they give the vow, is their expectation that people will completely abstain? And if so, if that's how they're describing it, then that's how you're taking it. So you may want to get clarity from the preceptor if at some point in the future you start thinking about this and you think you're someone who may want to have a glass of wine here and there, you may want to get some clarity. How is that vow being offered, or how does the preceptor think of that vow? Yeah, is that everything that I'm trying to think? Yep, I think that was everything. Okay, any thoughts or questions about the 5 lay vows?
Well, I know we don't have time for this, but for each one of those, there are some interesting cases. So, for example, for the first vow, what if the only way to preserve your life is to take another? Right? So, killing in self-defense. Is your assailant's precious life worth more than your own precious life?
Well, it is still a negative action. It is not, there is no exception in the precept for self-defense. It's not as negative as it would be if you were killing out of malice, or you were killing out of, that's certainly worse. But Buddhism doesn't have the idea, because you have decided that, again, as you said, you've decided that your life is more important than their life. Now, they've put their life in danger by attacking you, but still you've decided that your life is more important than their life. And that's negative from the Buddhist perspective. That way of thinking empowers or triggers ways of thinking, and that feed fundamental ignorance, that don't lead us closer to enlightenment. So what Buddhism would recommend is, trying to run away, trying to, you could wound, if you felt like it was possible to wound that person in a non-fatal way so that you could escape, you could try to do that. But yeah, there are no exceptions. There are no cases where Buddhism says, because it's not moralistic, it has to do with the energy that is arising in the mind at the time that you're engaging in the action. And at that time, you're perceiving the continuation of your life to be of more importance than the continuation of their life. And that way of thinking is not what leads a person closer to enlightenment. That way of thinking takes a person further away from enlightenment. If a person ran into a situation like that, if they were to talk to their preceptor, I would imagine that their preceptor would probably say you have to take the vow again, because there are no exceptions. Now, your preceptor would understand that's a very unique situation, unlikely to ever occur again. So they wouldn't have any qualms about giving you that vow again, because how many people run into that like consistently? Um, Whereas if you were a serial killer, your preceptor would probably be like, I don't think Buddhism is for you. Like they would probably, you know, you know, not think that you could uphold that vow. So,
Venerable, I have a question about
mhm,
that. I've often heard in Buddhist meetings, people, hosts telling us, do not be so selfless as to allow yourself to be abused. Okay,
mhm.
in other words, if it's a relationship, get out of the relationship, save a child from it. But isn't killing somebody the ultimate abuse? So we should, if the only way we can get out of it is by defending our own life by killing the other person,
Yeah,
that
well, I mean, the good news is that it's probably never going to happen. So,
true. Hope
as a
so.
practical issue, that's the good news. Um, but as I said, the best thing to do is to not intend to kill them. The best thing to do is to try to, as I said, run away, to wound them, shoot them in the leg, or, that's the best thing to do, is to not hold the view, because the idea is we're going to die anyway. This life is going to come to an end anyway, and if from a karmic perspective, you could say, if we died cherishing that other person's life, even though they threatened our own, that is a really powerful karma. That's a really beneficial, powerful karma. Whereas if we do survive, but we survive because of the fear and the animosity that naturally would arise, and that sense of ill will that we would naturally, unavoidably be generating, we have to contend with that. Those are seeds that we've now laid down in the mind. And there are practitioners who would say that they don't want to contend with that, that they don't want to lay down those seeds of that kind of ill, because we don't have the skillfulness to be able to engage in that without the arising of that ill will, that negative perspective. So, yeah. But like I say, the good news is probably, we won't actually have to deal with it.
Thank you for
But yeah, like I
explaining
say,
all that.
in the teachings, in terms of labeling it as a negative action, there's no way to take the life of a human or an animal or an insect that isn't going to be labeled as negative. It isn't possible. But there are degrees of negative. So
So I assume
Buddhism isn't
I,
going to say it is okay that because again, it's not moralistic. It's the energy that arises in the mind when that action is engaged in, and that energy is going to be based on animosity. It's going to be based on fear. It's going to be based on ill will. It's going to be, and that's not positive. That is negative. It's unavoidable that it will be like that.
I can give one more example on this topic. So I think this would clearly apply to suicide. But what about the case when, since we know that death is imminent and we're given a diagnosis that, we're going to live out the next 8 months of our life in increasingly terrible pain before we die, and we want to fly to Belgium and get euthanasia, is that similarly? Because the intention is to reduce our suffering, and so we could die more peacefully.
So technically, from the Buddhist perspective, suicide isn't actually considered an act of killing because the person dies at the same time that the body and mind separate. So in order, we'll talk about that later when we look at karma. But in order for karma to attach, the person engaging in the action has to observe that action occurring. And because the act of dying coincides with the act of committing suicide, that mind can't perceive the death of itself. So it's actually not the karma of killing. However, it is considered to be a negative action. Of course, it's quite understandable because we may have not developed the ability to handle, like you're saying, these really incredibly difficult states that a person might have to deal with. We may not have developed that capacity, maybe beyond our capacity to handle that. But that is a kind of defeatist sort of view. So it's not considered positive, but it is sort of, it can be understandable. It's not moralistic. We have to really understand that the Buddha didn't teach, or largely didn't doesn't teach in moralistic terms. But that idea that I should separate, because even if a person is suffering, they can still generate positivity. They can still make spiritual progress. And they are giving that up because it's difficult. And that viewpoint isn't great as a karmic potential, as a karmic seed to lay down in the mind. But like I say, we could be faced with something incredibly difficult. And, so it's not a moralistic judgment. It's just to say that willingly giving up this incredible opportunity that we have as a tendency isn't encouraged in Buddhism. Buddhism wouldn't say, that's great, go ahead and do that, totally fine, no problem. It's not considered ideal, is what I can say.
All right. If we have time, I'll just go through them one by one. So the notion.
I do have to go. I'm getting picked up.
Oh, okay,
So
okay, all
I
right.
do have
Just
to
because
go.
each one of these has so many interesting case studies to talk about,
Sure.
but I'll save that for later.
Sure. Yeah, we can circle back to next week. Any other broad sort of clarifications or misunderstandings or? All right. So we will pick this up next week.
Thank you, Venerable.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Venerable.
coming.